Hello and welcome to the two-man power trip of wrestling. My host, JP John Poz. With me today, very special guest, the son of the legendary Gene Anderson. He's been in the NWA, JCP, out there in Portland, World Wrestling Council down there in Puerto Rico. He's been everywhere. Mr. Brad Anderson. Brad, welcome. How you doing?
Doing great. Thanks for having me on.
What is going on in your world? Anything wrestling related going on with you?
Uh, Actually, there is, and I've been pretty quiet in the wrestling world. I've done a couple interviews lately, but I am doing a fan fest in July 12th for Greg Price. He used to have a really big one in Charlotte the first weekend of August every year, but he's doing it again, and it's going to be in Monroe, North Carolina, at the Agricultural Center. And I know Rock and Roll Express is going to be there. Tito Santana. Of course, I'm giving it a plug for him. Curtis Thompson, myself, and there's going to be a lot more people that be on the list, obviously. But that's what's happening. But that's my only real wrestling thing going on, to meet and greet fans, which I love seeing fans, and I love seeing some of the guys from back in the day also.
Very cool that he's doing it. I didn't realize he still did shows, Greg. I didn't even realize that.
Yeah, he stopped, and then about a year ago, he did one in downtown Charlotte.
Oh, that's right, with the Mulkeys, right? The Mulkeys were there. Yes. Okay.
Believe so. It like was there was a WWE event the same nights, and he kind of did a thing like right next to the Coliseum or whatever it was where they wrestled at. And yeah, they had something going on down there. He tried to get me for that one, but I just started a new job and I couldn't get out of it because it was on Friday. But yeah, he always has his hand in the business still. He's a great guy.
It's very interesting, though. Like when you're out of the business, then you go back in and you're doing the conventions. It's like you're like the rare guest. You know what I mean? Like you kind of been out of it for a minute. So that's a kind of a cool spot because sometimes those rare guests are hard to find.
Yeah, I mean gosh, I think it's probably been since maybe 15 years since I've done a fan fest, something close to that. And yeah, it was always great seeing people from over the years. You'd remember them, from the matches when they'd come up to you and speak to you, and then to see them there up close, more close and personal, was always that much better. Because you're just walking by them, but it's a really cool thing to be able to see people. And as time goes on, I've been in and out of thinking like wrestling. What I knew of wrestling has changed so much. I don't think of wrestling that I did as anywhere near the same thing, but it's still great to see the people that loved what like my dad did and the era that I was in it and stuff like that. It's great to know those people are still out there and have a passion to meet the guys that entertained them back in the day.
Definitely. And I feel like the Southern wrestling fan, they're usually pretty loyal, usually pretty good fan as far as like those meet and greets and stuff. They usually are very good, very nice.
Yeah, I mean, I remember growing up in Charlotte, North Carolina, and all you ever heard was the only two sports in Charlotte are wrestling and racing. And of course, that was before the Charlotte Hornets and the Carolina Panthers, but that was like, yeah, we got two sports in Charlotte. It's wrestling and racing. And I mean, that was what, the entertainment was for people, back then.
For sure. When you are breaking into the business, going all the way back, probably late 80s, right? Probably around 88, when you're breaking in, is it an automatic that you're going to be in wrestling? Like you're definitely going to be in the business? Or was it the opposite? Did your dad maybe not want you in the business?
Gosh, no, ever since I can remember, he always groomed me to be in the business. I mean, ever since I can remember, there were always comments about you have to do this if you want to be a wrestler, kid. And I mean, I wanted to be a wrestler. I mean, any kid who watches his dad do that stuff and then has the opportunity to meet all these other wrestlers, I can only speak for myself though, I guess, but it would be crazy to not want to be a part of that. But he used to always, Dad was in the office for Crockett. And so one of the main things Dad did was Crockett would have Dad give out the checks to the boys because the boys had the boys being the wrestlers for, some people. I know everybody understands the lingo these days. I guess I'm speaking and everybody knows it already, but the boys respected Dad so much that even though they were probably getting screwed on their checks, he was kind of like the mediator, because they
Yeah.
wouldn't. But that being said, that was one of his jobs. So any new wrestler that came into the territory, God, there's a list of names. He'd always say, "Hey, go down there and meet my kid at the YMCA or at Rick Steamboat's gym, or there was another Gold's Gym in Charlotte." And I'd like at 12 years old, starting out, I would be working out with, who was some of the first? Well, Don Kernoodle wrestled with the Iron Sheik, amateur wrestling. He just basically stretched me. I was 12 years old. Lifting Lex Luger, Ricky Steamboat. All those guys, just out of respect for my dad, they had, it was like I guess an honor for them to, be able, because of the respect they had for him, to go work out with me. No, I'm sure they're like, Jesus, what, this young kid. But yeah, so, he kind of, I wanted to do it, but he helped groom me along the way. And then I did start when I was about 16, 17, when Dad and Nelson Roll had a wrestling school. I'd go up there and wrestle with some of the guys and train a little bit to break into the business a little bit, very slowly at that time. But yes, to answer your question, pretty much ever since I can remember, I wanted to be a wrestler, and I was kind of groomed to do that also.
You got to settle this for me though, because you're an Anderson, right? You're coming into the business. Are you, and basically your dad, as far as at that point, are you the only real Andersons, or do you guys not think that? Do you consider all the other guys Andersons as well?
I always kind of considered Ole an Anderson, just because, well, my dad's from Minneapolis, obviously. My mom's, I never really met any family. My grandparents had all passed away, and their families the rest of their families were so far away. I never really met them. So Ole Anderson was the only uncle, I knew, and he probably was more of an uncle than anything I ever knew. So yeah, even though I knew blood wise, he wasn't related to me, but he and Dad were, they were thick as thieves. They had a bond between them closer than most brothers would have. So I did consider him an Anderson. I did gloat. I was in high school when Arn came around, just because it kind of, reinvigorated the whole Anderson gimmick. But, as time went on, I realized Arn kind of didn't, I don't know. He loved being an Anderson and getting, I don't know. That's a different topic there. I love Arn. I didn't think of him as an Anderson. Once I got to know him, nothing against him. But
Why not though? Why is he not?
he was very distant. A lot of the boys, I grew up, I like I said, working out with some of them. My dad, I was one of the few kids that was lucky. Dad would take me to the matches. Also, they would do interviews on Wednesdays at the Crockett office. Like, we're going to be in Raleigh or Greensboro, and they would shoot their interviews. You remember the old days when, we're going to be here, I'm wrestling so-and-so. And so all of those guys would be at the office on Wednesdays, and it'd start like 10 o'clock in the morning, and everybody's standing around together. You couldn't say this years ago because of kayfabe, but you had the heels and the faces all together. And that in the summertime when I was out of school, I loved going down there, and I'd hang out with all the guys, and all those guys, I created a relationship with a lot of them, so that when I did get in the business, we, still, they knew me. Arn, I'm never going to say he never did anything wrong, but he never helped either. He never went out of his way to talk to me about anything from a match, as opposed to some of the guys that would come up and, hey kid, that was good, or that was the shits, or, and I was always told, go up to one of the old timers or the top guys and, hey, can you watch my match for me and see, tell me what I did. I never felt comfortable doing that with Arn. It's funny. I did an interview a couple months ago, and a similar question was asked, and I answered. I said I felt Arn tried to he distance himself from being an Anderson. And again, this is no disrespect for Arn. Nobody ever called Ole Anderson Rock. He was always Ole Anderson. And I watched videos and stuff after I had this interview, and I noticed how it was almost like Arn was trying to separate Ole as not being an Anderson. So he wasn't an Anderson. It was a different entity. Like he could be Arn, use that name, but just create his own image, which he did, and he did wonderfully. He's a great worker. But I always felt, like one day, like obviously Arn has his son in the business now, Brock. You would think at some point that like he would say, hey, well, Brad might not be the best, but he's what we got for now. Let me talk to him and help him to carry us through to the next generation, possibly, because that's kind of like the way it works in the wrestling, especially when you have second, third generation. They're always thinking, I mean, I know most wrestlers do. They're like, well, my kid could be in the business. I mean, look at it. It works great. Dusty Rhodes, Cody Rhodes, Randy Orton, or Bob Orton Jr., all those guys. They probably were in the same situation I was. And I never felt comfortable speaking to him like that. And it might have been me, I don't know, but I do know I had a lot of the top guys that would talk to me. And it was just amazing. It was like, these were my heroes. And they're telling me that was a great match, kid, or being able to hang out with them and party after some of the matches but never happened with Arn.
Now, Gene, obviously your dad, legendary guy, the original Anderson, if you will, the Anderson. Do you think when you come into the business that is just an enormous amount of pressure being put on you because you're an Anderson, but you're like a real Anderson? So, I mean, is that a lot to be thrown into the wolves? Like you said, he wanted to groom you to be a wrestler, but that seems like a added pressure.
Well, yes. And I mean, you could ask, I grew up, not grew up, from about junior high school age. Dustin Rhodes and I were best friends until we graduated high school. And we're still friends in the business for several years. Dustin Rhodes could never be Dusty Rhodes. I could never be Gene Anderson. I mean, I don't know. I don't say I felt it, but after a couple of years in the business, I realized I was like, I'm never going to be that. I mean, I had gotten the boots with the maroon and yellow stripes. But I realized after wearing them for a year or two, I was like, I need to, kind of like what Randy Orton did. I mean, and Dustin did also. They created their own image, but still had that name for themselves. But yeah, it was a huge pressure. And there becomes a point where you just accept that you're never going to be that. I mean, that's never going to, because that's what the fans want to see. They want to relive seeing Gene and Ole Anderson, or Gene and Lars Anderson, or they want to relive seeing Dusty Rhodes again one more time through their children. That is just impossible. So I love, Dustin has had a great career. Cody, Randy Orton, Barry Windham, all these second and third generation guys created kind of their own gimmick. But yeah, you have to accept the fact you're never going to be your father.
So when you are being trained, how much is him training you as far as Gene, and how much is Nelson Royal?
that was actually an early agreement. Because like I said, I was about 16 years old, and I wasn't even really smartened up yet. I would get when they would have the tryouts, I would get in the ring with the guys that were wanting to be wrestlers that they had Dad and Nelson had put through the ringer, where they were so exhausted they could barely even walk through to the ring and get through the ropes, let alone stand up. But I mean, starting at 14 years old, I would go in there, I'd start shooting on them. true, just amateur moves, nothing, not trying to hurt anybody, but that's what Dad and Nelson, they wanted to send a message to these guys. I'm sure you've heard of all the horrifying trouts some of the guys have had with some
Oh
of
yeah.
and I remember getting called. I don't know the language on your show, but I was called some pretty names because I wasn't being hard enough on these guys. So, but they get back to your question. I apologize. They did say, Dad said Nelson's going to train you, which was smart because at about 16 years old, even though your dad's Gene Anderson or whoever your dad, Dustin knows his dad's, you're not going to listen to him for the most part. I mean, shut up, Dad, or whatever. So Nelson trained me for the most part. Whenever I would have a match or Dad would feed some input here or there about how you can do this, that. But I would say 90% of my training was through Nelson Royal, who taught me amazing psychology for the business and the physical aspect also.
Anybody else that was training with you that we would know, like any other NWA guys or anybody else that made a name for themselves in the business?
Gosh, that wrestling school had so many names that went through there. Short-term guys. So to start it off, I know Johnny Ace, John Laurinaitis. He was there for they sent him there to try to polish him off a little bit. I'm trying to think of some of the really well. You had Curtis Thompson, and Curtis is going to be at the Fan Fest in July also. He did the Chip the Firebreaker gimmick. Amazing looking guy. But I'll name some quick. We had Trent Knight, Joe Cruz, Tommy Angel, David Isley. A lot of these guys I'm saying you saw doing jobs a lot on TV, but they were great. Ricky Nelson. I mean, it was just like a who's who at that time of guys, and they were great workers. Unfortunately, there weren't many spots to be filled in wrestling, and the matches that were being had on television or being done on television were squash jobs. And so a lot of these guys, and myself included, that's when they put the hood on me because they didn't want to kill me off as an Anderson. But that was the only place to do that because all the territories were closing. And the only way to get any type of experience is do television jobs. And a lot, they were just basically fed, through JCP, WWF at the time to get squashed a lot of the times. These guys could outwork a lot of the guys that they were working in the ring with. And Nelson and Dad were constantly getting phone calls from WWF and Jim Crockett, or it was WCW by the time I got into it, because their guys were so good that, they were great talent that they wanted them on television.
So the Zan Panzer gimmick under the mask was literally just because they didn't want you to be exposed as Brad Anderson, basically.
Yes. Well, my first the first gimmick I did at first was Agent Steel, and
Right.
Okay, and that was the reason why, because there was no I was 18 years old. There wasn't really a territory to go to. I did end up going to Calgary about 6 months after breaking into the business, but they figured we'll just put a hood on them, and let them get some experience here. And after a while, I was on TV too much with Agent Steel. I remember my dad said, "You need to do a gimmick, kid, if you need to, want to be on television." So I know the bright, crazy colors were the big thing back in the early 90s. And I kind of came up with that gimmick. And it's probably the Zan Panzer gimmick is probably more memorable than Brad Anderson was for the majority. Your hardcore fans, I'm sure, will know Brad Anderson, but Zan Panzer is probably the more popular. And actually, that's going to be part of that fan fest. We're going to have the hood there, and I think Greg's giving away a door prize to have that pink and black hood for some. And but it was a pretty wild I put that hood on for the first time, and the person who did, I could not even see out of it. And I'm not smart. I didn't really try it on until the match. And I'm like out there basically just wrestling blind, and later got it, fixed where I could see a little bit better. But that was the premise. They didn't want to bury me as an Anderson. And of course, some of the hardcore fans knew. I remember going to Greensboro one time, and I was on the billing as Zan Panzer, and I'm out there in the Zan Panzer outfit, gimmick, and someone made a sign, and they actually drew the Zan Panzer face, and it said, Zan Panzer equals Brad Anderson, the master of disguise, ? And I just remember, I was like, I was so bottom level back then, but I was like, this is a real fan right here to waste the time, he wasn't wasting his time. I felt like that. For me, it was to make this poster, bring it. And I was like, but how did he even know that was, because all you had was the kayfabe sheets back then. There was no internet, You had your weekly sheets that would come out, and I guess that's how the people found their information back then.
Smart fan though, that he knew that Zan was you. That's pretty good.
I was highly impressed. I wanted to go out and shake his hand, but he was farther back, and I was being fed to just go out there, and I'm sure I was putting somebody over, even though it was a house show. So it ended up being a decent wrestling match, because that was when you could have your good matches. And a lot of those times when they would put me on the house shows, I did start getting a lot of house shows. I would wrestle as Brad Anderson, and Kevin Sullivan, when he was on the booking committee, for some reason took a liking to me. I never put on good size until my late 20s, and I was probably only like 20 years old at this time. But he was feeding me bookings left and right. And I have mentioned this before because it was such a memorable experience. We were in Beckley, West Virginia, and I went out there to wrestle Kevin Sullivan. And, he's pretty much beating the shit out of me the whole match, like he does. And he shoots me out, and he says, when I shoot you out, I'm going to come to the ropes, give me a gut shot, sunset flip me in. I'm like, okay. So he shit cans me. He feeds to the ropes. I give him the, shoulder block to his abdomen, and then sunset flip over. And the ref, it was Tommy Young, and I'm sorry, it was Nick Patrick. He's counting 1, 2, and Kevin hooks my leg and like hooks me so that I have to pin him. And I'm expecting him to kick out, and all of a sudden I feel him, hooking me to where neither one of us can move. And Nick hits 3, and so I win this match. And Nick's trying to raise my hand, and I'm like, no, I was supposed to, I was supposed to do the job tonight. I'm scared to death. I'm thinking I'm going to be in trouble. And I went back through the curtain, and Kevin he knew how to. Those guys knew you can lose a match and still maintain your heat. So he stayed out there doing his thing to maintain his image and keep his heat. But when he came back through, they had the big, long 30-foot, 20-foot curtains or whatever. And he started on me immediately. He's like, oh, you little fucking stooge. Wait, I tell your father, you hooked me, you little fucker. And I'm saying, no, I didn't. I'm scared to death thinking I'm going to lose my job. And the whole with a rib on me. He hooked me and to me, and he's like, this was good for the business, kid. He goes, everybody here knew or thought that I was just going to beat you. He said, but we made that end of it a match, and now they have to think for themselves, hey, maybe this shit's a little real, And it was always that swerve. Kevin had a great mind for the business. And it made a lot of sense, because people are like, how did that just happen, But that was one of my he actually did that a couple more times after that in other house shows. And it never had the same effect as that first night. But I'll never forget that.
It's awesome, though. You could basically, if you look at it, you're going over Kevin Sullivan, pretty big star,
But you know what? Those guys, they don't, and that's how I was always taught, it doesn't matter if you lose. It's what you do after the other guy raises, he gets his hand raised, how you get your heat back, or if you're a baby face, which I wasn't really trained how to be a baby face. So I don't really know what you could do, but as a heel, I know how you can get. I mean, Roddy Piper even said it: win, lose, or draw. He always got his arm raised after the match, and he would do it in different ways because that's one of the last things that people see. One of my heroes who I never was able to meet, but Dad was always telling me to watch his videos, was Johnny Valentine. He wouldn't say it; he would just walk to the ring. He might take 10 minutes to get to the ring, and the fans wanted to rip his throat apart just because of how he could carry himself, you know. And I'll go back to my dad and Ole, how many matches they either lost or won, and they even the ones they won, they would be selling their ass off back to the dressing room, even though they had just won the match, and that got more heat than anything. Then, you know, usually they're the heels, it's going to be a screwed finish, and the fans will get hot at that. But you know, Ole's carrying Dad back to the ring, and everybody's like, they should have never beat, you know, Ricky Steamboat and Jay Young, but that was bullshit. And look how beat up they are. Some, you know, the fans, that was how they kept their heat constantly. And even if they would lose, they would do something to keep their reputation and their heat going. So yeah, Kevin didn't have a problem putting me over or anybody over.
So were there certain guys that you liked working versus not? Like, did you like working Flair or Sting or Luger, Ron Simmons, etc., like Fantastics? Who did you like working?
My favorite was Brad Armstrong. Um, or of course of the Midnight Express, but single matches with Brad Armstrong were, I mean, he was so good that he made me better, and he did it with everybody he wrestled. I remember wrestling in Greenville, South Carolina. It was my first few months in the business. I was agent still, wrestled with Brad Armstrong. We had a TV match, but it was back and forth, and you know, Brad went over, but it was such a great match. I remember walking back, and they had the curtains there too. It was like an auditorium, and Hawk was standing there watching the match. And I mean, I was a huge mark for the Road Warriors growing up. And Hawk looked at me and said, Jesus, kid, you're a fucking natural. And I mean, that was like one of the biggest compliments to this day. But I knew also it was because I just had a match with Brad Armstrong, because they made it so easy. But yeah, it was, I wrestled, I mean, gosh, all those guys that I grew up watching, Flair, Steamboat, Wahoo McDaniel, the Road Warriors, I wrestled all those guys. And there were only a few moments of it's just like seems surreal. It didn't ever bother me wrestling Flair because I knew him so well from a kid. He and Dad were great friends. I mean, I'd been around them a lot of my life as a kid. But wrestling the Road Warriors the first time and standing in the ring and hearing Iron Man, you know, and you're just like, I'm getting ready to be that guy that they would run up here and stomp a mud hole in his ass and leave the ring. Like, I wasn't scared because I knew they would take care of you, but it was very surreal. Wrestling Ricky Steamboat one of the first times was just like, I panicked a little bit. I'm like, oh my, I looked across the ring. I'm like, oh my God, that's Ricky Steamboat. Even though he had trained me in the gym for years. I mean, we used to work out before he had opened his gym in Charlotte. He had all of his equipment in a barn. Abe Jacobs had some country, old timer Abe Jacobs. I don't know if you remember that name, but he was storing all of his equipment in the barn, and we would go out and work in the barn, and there would be horses in their stalls looking at you while you're working out with hay on the floor. But it was yeah, the first time I wrestled him, it was just like, this was like my teacher, and I'm wrestling him now. Another one though was that scared me actually was Wahoo McDaniel, only because that was one of the few people my dad said, if you make him mad, you're going to have to kill him to stop him from getting back at you. Wahoo was a great guy. When he lost his anger and temper, there was no stopping him. And I just, that was in my head. And I mean, even again, I knew him, but it was just like, I hope I don't mess up and him get hot and just start beating the hell out of me. It didn't happen, but those were, some of the fearful ones. But getting back to Bobby Eaton was great. Brad Armstrong, some of those, they're such great natural workers that you didn't even feel like you had to do anything.
When you're in the NWA, right, and you're kind of going through, do you also do some jobs for WWF as well?
Actually, the summer of '88, who was it? I think it was Pat Patterson. Actually, got in touch with Nelson and needed some guys for WWF, and they sent a whole crew up there. They like rented a van for us or something. There was like a dozen of us that went. And I remember they had told Nelson that I couldn't wear a hood because they're very, they pushed guys with hoods. They had a lot of rules there. Like they'd have the sign, when they'd have the matches lined up, and they'd say no matching tights. So you couldn't even have black tights if the guy you were working with had black tights. They had a lot of stuff like that. So obviously they weren't going to let me wear a hood. But Nelson said, and I'm 18 years old. Looking back now, I laugh at how stupid this was. And Nelson's like, well, just get some face paint or something and, like gimmick your face up like a Road Warrior or the Barbarian or something. And so I'm in the dressing room, and we were actually, it was Albany, New York. And I mean, they put on a production, at least back in the day, because they would film like a whole month of TV in like 3 days. So there's a lot going on. And I remember being in the dressing room, and I'm putting the makeup on, and one of the agents came out. I was like, "Oh, kid, what are you doing?" I'm like, I was still probably feeling a little bit entitled because of who my dad was. I'm like, well, I'm Gene Anderson's son. I was told, I'm supposed to wear this so one day they don't recognize me like I'm supposed to be some big star. But they're like, no, you're not wearing that. And so yeah, we did go up there, did it a few times only because they paid so well at that time. They was like at least 2 or 3 times what WCW was paying. But I did go up there, but they didn't mistreat you well. I mean, mistreat you, but they didn't treat you well either. I mean, as far as they put you, the job guys, they had their own area that they had to stay in. I mean, I was able to go speak to some of the guys that I knew that had been in Jim Crockett Promotions that had gone to New York, and be like, hey, I remember me, Brad. We were like, they would take me out to dinner when I was a kid and stuff like that. So I had a little bit more leeway to access areas, but it wasn't a real fun time going up there.
Does the people in the NWA, or does your dad mind that you go to WWF and do jobs on TV, or they don't really care about that?
I mean, he was the one that was with Nelson that got me booked up there. So I can only assume that he didn't have a problem with it. I mean, at the time, again, there was nowhere to work. I mean, I did go to Calgary. I was in Portland. You couldn't stay in those territories for long because there was just no money. You would try to go in there with some money in your pocket and live off of what you made there and what you brought with you. And then at some point, you just couldn't survive anymore, and you'd have to leave. So I don't know what he was thinking really, but I mean, they would also say back in the day, I mean, you've seen many guys. I mean, Jeff Hardy did jobs in the WWE
Yeah.
before.
Yep.
Out there, a lot of guys that did jobs, and I'm guessing he thought it could be that type of thing where, you know, one the guys who had done jobs and they rebrandish him as, in a new gimmick or something like that. But when I was up there in the W, I was never Brad Anderson. I was like, I don't even, they would just throw some name, Paul King or something like that. So they never mentioned who I was. I was just somebody else on TV that was getting ready to get beat.
Right. And obviously, like you mentioned, not Zan Panzer, who kind of was getting over a little bit NWA, so a little bit protected by the hood again.
Yeah. Yeah. Zan Panzer, I think he had a pretty, I didn't realize he had such a big following. I know whenever I've done some interviews lately or something, been on something, and as Brad Anderson, and always there'll be, you know, comments, Zan Panzer and Cornette. He's the one he made the comment one time. Zanfir Pan Flute. I think he said the master of the flute. The flute or something. And that's one of the comments I hear all the time. Zanfir Pan Flute, because of what Cornette said. But yeah, there's like kind of like the Mulkeys, you know, they see someone on there getting beat enough, they start to want them to win. You know, when I was doing the gimmick, I hope I worked a lot better in the ring with my opponents than the Mulkeys. I mean, they didn't get very much when they were in their matches, but you do get some some love from the fans for going out there and doing what you do.
So how come you leave NWA and basically go to some of the territories back then? I mean, you go to Portland, you're going different places. How come you left? Did you feel like you needed to, or did maybe your dad say you should go out there and go to Portland or wrestle elsewhere?
Both. Well, I went to Calgary after being in the business for about 6 months. Um, that was probably a very bad idea. I mean, I was so scared. I was 18 years old. I mean, 2,500, 3,000 miles away from home. Didn't know anybody. I did have some of my mom's family there, but it was to get experience. Didn't work out real good there. But I was able to meet some great guys. I was only there about 5 or 6 weeks. When I was there, you had Chris Benoit was there, which, I mean, I was able to be a friend of his for years thereafter. But it was a great learning territory. I've told the story before. It was crazy. I got kicked out of Canada.
Oh,
When I was 17 years old, we would in North Carolina, you would always go to Myrtle Beach, South Carolina for spring break. Well, I'm a 17-year-old and I'm down there and we're drinking beer, doing what you do in high school at 17. And one of my buddies like, hey, let's go steal these beer signs, because all the different beer companies would put up, they would have a spring break fest, and they had Bud Light signs, Coors Light, whatever, Miller. So we went down there and stole some of the signs. It was just signs that would, tie up to stakes, right? But then also there was like a pair of snow skis that had Michelob Light on them, because they had a snow run, like a hill basically that, you just slide down. And I'm like, oh shit, that would look really cool. I didn't even drink Michelob Light. Well, I throw them in the back of the car. I'm driving back to the place I'm staying at, and I see a police car, and as a 17-year-old stupid, I just hit my brakes in the middle of the road because I know I had stolen beer signs and a pair of skis. Well, the cop sees me and he pulls me over. Long story short, I get arrested for petty larceny. So I was 7, but when I went to Calgary, I remember being told, well, you're a minor here in the States, it's not going to be on your record. So you had to fill out your little thing to enter Canada, and have you ever been arrested? And I was like, well, no, I was a minor. So I just answered no. So while I was there, I'd been there a few weeks, and we were going to wrestle in the United States down in Montana. And there was a very small border crossing, and it would close. It was like at 6 o'clock at night, and we had to wrestle that night. We got there late to the border crossing. It was like 6:05 or something. And so you had in Calgary, you had all the heels in one van, like a 14 passenger van, and all the faces in another 14 passenger van. And they would kind of stay near each other because in the winter, especially the weather up there. Well, we both get there. They won't let us through. Well, of course, the heels, they get out and they're raising hell. And the border, it was only one border agent lady, and it's in the middle of nowhere. So she leaves. And the boys, they start just vandalizing the place. Stole extension cords, peeing all over just the crazy shit some of the boys do. Well, we had to drive back into Canada and then try to get back through in the morning. Well, we were there first thing in the morning, and that border agent did not realize what had happened. They let us through. Later on, they realized all this stuff had been vandalized, items had been stolen. So she knew we were going back through into Canada. It was called the Port of Climax. I'll never forget that name. And so we wrestled in Montana, tried to get back through, and I was in the babyface van. It was like Benoit, Beef Wellington, Johnny Smith did the British Bulldog type gimmick up there. Anyway, and I'm sitting in the back of the van. I'm 18. I'm like a mouse sitting on cotton. You don't even hear me speak. Well, we were sitting there for a while, and the border agent came out because the other border agent had called that crossing and said, hey, these guys vandalized my space, stole some things, look for these items in their van, and basically harass them. Well, the stuff that had been stolen was tossed out. It was just worthless stuff. They were just doing it to piss off. But they looked up all of our records, and they saw that I had a petty larceny arrest charge in the States at 17, which I guess in Canada you're considered an adult, and it's a felony there. There's no petty, it's just larceny. And so they came up to the van and were like, Bradley Anderson, you need to get off. And again, to make this story a little shorter, they wouldn't let me in. Well, the van full of faces and heels, they go on. They were heading somewhere in Saskatchewan. And I'm sitting there. In this border crossing, if you do Google Maps and do Port of Climax, it's in the middle of nowhere still. I had to wait until the border crossing closed that day, and the border agent drove me back into Havre, Montana, and I had to pay her $20, and I had to get a discretionary grant of entry that let me get back into Canada for 30 days, and then I had to leave. I was kicked out of Canada after that. My mom was Canadian, so I could have filed for dual citizenship, but I have never known anybody that was kicked out of Canada. I know politics now, it's a little tough, but I've never known anybody that was kicked out of Canada. But honestly, it kind of worked out because I was so homesick, and I was just scared there at the time. I was too young to be doing that far away. So I came home, and I did more of the TV and ended up going to Portland after that. But that was the reason. It was just too much job doing on TV, and not, even though I'd get house matches, it's not like working. You're not working 6-7 days a week like you would in a small territory to get that real experience. So that was how I ended up in Portland after that, in Puerto Rico, Alabama, the Continental Wrestling area.
Do you think that's necessary, to get out? Because you're in NWA, you're in the second biggest promotion, if you will, WCW technically at that time. Do you think it's necessary to kind of get out, do that, earn your stripes, get some more experience, get some more ring time, then come back?
At the time, it was because I was getting house show bookings with NWA, WCW, like what I said with Kevin Sullivan. He got me a lot, but it was still. I might only get, not counting TVs, I might only have gotten 5 or 6 a good month, maybe 10 house shows out of the month. And that it's that regular, repetition of being, hitting the road, being in a show every night that really gets that experience. At least it was back then. So at the time, it definitely was an asset to do that. And it was also part of paying your dues. You always hear the wrestlers, well, he never paid his dues. Well, the top guys who were still around, they paid their dues. And it might have been a self, painful thing to force yourself to do it. But you paid your dues by doing those things. And that group of guys, I mean, Stone Cold, you hear Mark Callis, Undertaker talk about that. I mean, the dues they paid, and there's just a much more level of respect from the entire wrestling world when they know you've done those things.
When you are like in the other territories stuff, is the end game to always come back and come to WCW, but be more polished, be a better wrestler, like maybe be a bigger name? Is that always the end game for you?
Was my thought, yes. And I didn't handle things real well. I was asked this question before, and I was very timid. I see guys they would be just so aggressive with the bookers and the agents. And growing up in the business, when I said earlier, Dad would bring me to the shows. I was that child that you can be seen but don't be heard. You know, I mean, I was never mistreated or anything, and the boys would speak to me. But I mean, I would be like a fixture in the locker room when I'd go in there. I'd, you know, and I was a dad. You know, he's like, just, you know, you don't need to talk to these guys unless, you know, they talk to you. And so I was scared to death to speak up. And I think, you know, later in life, that mindset stayed with me in those early years of wrestling, that I was literally afraid to speak up to some of these guys because it was that, you know, youthful, you know, it was ingrained in my head that, you know, you don't talk to these wrestlers. And the one time, Dusty Rhodes came up to me. We're in South Georgia. I want to say it was either Macon or Columbus, Georgia. And he was the booker at the time. And Dustin this was summer of '88. Dustin had just was breaking into business down in Florida. And this was when I was still Agent Steel, actually. And we're walking through, and he literally just stopped me. And I mean, everybody knows the stories of Dustin. I mean, he was like the president. You know, you don't stop Dusty and talk to him unless he speaks to you. But he stopped me, and he's like, "Hey kid, this was like July, August. I've been in the business about 3 months of '88." And he's like, "Hey kid, I've been watching you. You've been doing great. Dustin's down in Florida training." He goes, "What we're going to do is we're going to bring Dustin up, and we're going to make Agent Steel 1 and 2, meaning he's going to put a hood on Dustin, and we're going to do a tag team like that." And I guess he thought maybe give us a push. He said, "But then, you know, something's going to happen, and we're going to have someone rip the hoods off. And there you are, Anderson or Rhodes." And he said, "The American Wrecking Crew." And I'm like, oh man, I popped, man. I was like on cloud nine. And because he stopped me and brought this idea to me, I ran to the payphones. We didn't have cell phones back then, and called my dad. I never followed up with Dusty again about it. About 2 or 3 months went by, and we were in Atlanta at Center Stage, and you go in, and they have the little dry erase board with the matches on it for the night. And I see on there, it says Dustin Rhodes and Kendall Windham versus somebody. And they were called the Texas Broncos, I think. And I remember thinking, well, I guess there goes that gimmick for a push for me and Dustin, because it really looks like I'm not part of that now. But yeah, that was I would go to those territories and come back, but it was probably my fault because I never pushed it enough. I remember Michael Hayes talking to me after I came back from Portland, and he's like, "Hey kid, you know, I heard you drew some good houses out there." And I was like, "I don't know about that. I mean, I know I learned a lot. The houses were the shits out there, but and like that was a great opportunity." I mean, because he was in the office then, that, you know, and I just left it at that. It was like I was afraid to speak up for myself. From that earlier thought, I guess, of these guys are busy, they're superstars, you don't talk to them. But that was the mindset, to go to those places and come back.
When you do eventually come back, right, and you start working there again, you worked Vader, right? Is that right? You left, came back, and ended up working Vader?
I've worked Vader. I know. I don't. Again, there's been so many matches. I don't remember many of them. I vaguely, I guess I worked Vader. I don't remember that. mean, because kind of, I mean, if I did, it was before Vader started hurting guys.
Okay.
Because I know when you would show up and there was like an inside joke, if you had Vader when you saw that dry erase board, you either were a jabroni or you had heat with the office. I mean, that was, I don't even know if it was an inside joke. It was more real because also the Steiners, it was another one with them. That was less of because Rick would always take care of you. Scotty would too, but he would still come up. You would see him before the matches and he'd be walking in the hallways and he's thinking of ways that he's going to throw you through the fucking air. And like, it's just this new stuff. And I mean, I remember looking like, oh my God, I hope I don't have him tonight because he's all in his head. I mean, Scotty was always, but he was in a different plane. And so you're like, oh man, I don't want to be in that move that he's going to do. But that was another inside joke that if you had the Steiners, then you had heat also. But when I came back, I mean, I might have wrestled Vader. I don't remember. And again, it was before, I got taken care of a lot with who the guys they put me in the ring with. I mean, there's the nepotism of it, being Gene Anderson's son. Let's look out for him. So I didn't get in many matches like that the guys would hurt you.
When you are going back and wrestling or thinking back to some of the guys you did wrestle when you're going through, like, man, it's crazy. If you actually like kind of go back and look, it's like Steve Austin. Well, Mean Mark, Undertaker, Rick Rude, like the biggest of the big. I mean, you wrestled pretty much every big name. It's crazy. Sid on that list, Sting, Flair, like I said, Vader, the Steiners, Road Wars. Crazy how many awesome guys that you were in there with.
Yeah, I mean, I do remember those. Yeah, I don't remember some of the matches from them, but I remember it got to be the point where, like, at first it was like, oh my God, like I said earlier, these are my heroes. But then it just became business,
Yep.
I'll tell you, Sid Justice Vicious was always great behind the scenes. Whenever I had to work with him and he'd give you that power bomb, you can watch when he's working with a job guy and he's working with a top guy, the difference he does with that power bomb.
Yes.
I had a concussion one night and I mean, I guess he figured it's a TV, it's a job guy, even though he knew me because I'll tell a separate story here in a second, but I mean, he would plant you in that mat. But we were in a TV taping and Sid came up to me. And this was a time when WCW, if you had put on a pair of boots, you were probably a booker or in the booking committee there. It was so messed up. But Sid was in the booking committee and they were thinking up a new gimmick for Kevin Nash. And the gimmick was they wanted to do it called the Master Blasters. And they did come up with that later on, but the original one was supposed to be kind of like the Road Warrior 2 movie where you have this big Matt blaster, like if you remember the big guy from the Road Warrior movie and the little midget guy that like rode on his shoulders and he was like the brains of the big monster guy. Well, it was supposed to be like that in wrestling. Like I was supposed to be the smaller genius of the wrestling and the architect of how to wrestle, and Nash was supposed to be my monster. And it's like, I got this kid, I'm gonna push it for you. And I'm like, man, I'm popping, again, just kind of like when Dusty didn't have as much credence as when Dusty, because Dusty was the man back then. But I did take it with a grain of salt, but I was still excited. And then again, couple months later, I see on the board it said the Master Blasters, and it was Kevin Nash and I think Al Green. I think maybe.
Yeah. Yep.
Didn't last very long, but I was like, well, there goes another opportunity. And again, maybe I should have spoken up more and be like, well, Sid, had said to me, he had this gimmick. Can we, is anybody following up? I never said anything like that. I was just mortified to speak up honestly in some of those meetings around those guys, even though one-on-one I could talk to some of them, but when they got in that group it was just, I don't know, it was a different energy.
when you're going through right and in your career, do you ever have a WCW contract, or is it just something that you're in there, or they're basically paying you per appearance kind of thing?
Yeah, well, really, nobody had contracts back then. I think I want to say Luger might have been one of the first ones back in the day to get a contract, but it was always the old school. You go to a show, you get a percentage of the house. Now, when you did TVs and did jobs, it was a flat rate. But when I was doing house shows, it was always your typical percentage of the house. No contract. So it was basically, and it was like, same thing when I went to the smaller territories, we would work 6 days, sometimes 7 days a week. You had to be healthy or healthy enough to work in the ring, because you ain't working, you're not getting paid. It's not like today where you can disappear for 6 months and still get hundreds of thousands of dollars or millions, depending on who you were. But no, there really were no contracts. And like I said, I think Luger was one of the first ones, and that kind of started the whole snowball of, we're like, he got this money. And I will say that it was Luger. I remember that now, because that was just before, it was right on the time when J.C. Crockett sold to Turner, and they had the two airplanes that Crockett owned, and Dick Murdoch, it would never shy away from saying what was on his mind. And a lot of the guys were pissed that Luger, I think he got like a $750,000 a year contract in 88-ish, and which was unheard of at that time. And Luger was another guy that worked out with me in the gym. I have a great respect for him, but obviously he couldn't work a lick. And Murdoch would be ribbing him on the airplane and tell him he'd teach him how to do a headlock takeover for $150. And he would say it real loud so the boys would hear him and laugh. But at the same time, Luger would hear him and just kind of, cower down. But I mean, that was just, it got a lot of heat, and a lot of the guys were like, hey, if he's worth, I think Flair got a contract right after that, because they started talking like, hey, well, I need my money too. But nobody was on contract for the back then.
So as we start to head towards the wind down and start to head towards the finish, when do you start like thinking, like done with the business, or like even like in like the late '90s, were you thinking like, I'm kind of wanting to do something else, kind of want to retire? Like, were you thinking that, you're not going to get that big contract, if you will?
Well, it started when I was in Portland. I just won the Pacific Northwest Tag Team Championship belt with Ricky Santana. And finally, they started to push me there. And I fractured my spine. I got a cat trying to jump into the screen here.
Cat does it all the time.
And I'd fractured L4 in my back. And we had just got the straps put on us there. And after about a week or two, I was like, I can't wrestle 6-7 days a week, and I had to put my notice in. So I left there, came back to Charlotte, didn't work for about a month or two. And that's when I went to Puerto Rico. And I was like, okay, I thought I'd healed enough. I went to Puerto Rico, same thing down there, 6-7 days. You'd only work, you had Monday, Tuesday off. So it was 5 days a week. But just even that, I couldn't do it. So I came back to the States, and I basically retired. Then I did do a few shows. That would have been around 91 or 2. And I was like, I can't do this anymore. I didn't think I'd ever be able to wrestle again. And I was like, well, that's when I actually learned how to cut hair. And I kind of gave up on up at a hair salon, learned how to cut hair. Later, about 5 years later, I got healthy, started training again, and really put on size. This is about 97, 98. And I got back in the business. But at this point, I had kids and a family, and I was kind of doing it just to have fun and be in wrestling. I knew I did not want to be traveling and leaving my family. I saw how that worked. I grew up in that, so I was, I kept my toe in the pool, I guess, so to speak. But definitely didn't think of that as, and I was making good money having a hair salon too. I mean, I was never rich, but I didn't do without. And so basic was like, yeah, it is what it is right now. And again, like you asked earlier, I'm never going to be Gene Anderson. So, um, let me just have some fun right now.
Now, what is the story from a couple years ago? I remember you basically stiffed a guy in the ring. Am I getting that right? Because it was almost like a receipt type of thing. I kind of got overblown, if I remember correctly.
Blown. Yes, and I've spoken on this before one time, and it was very cathartic because, man, I got tore apart by the internet for this. And I guess from the videos that were shown, it maybe have looked that way, but it shows how much this business has changed. Also, what had happened, my youngest son wanted to get into wrestling. And so he was training with George South. And so I called a couple independent guys and I was like, hey, my kid wants, to get in the business. And there was one guy, Revolution Pro Wrestling, Julian Strauss out of High Point, North Carolina. And he's like, yeah, but we'd really like to use you. And I had not wrestled in years. I'm like, for my son, I'll do it. We'll do some kind of gimmick. Well, they set it up where some kid my son comes out there to accept a award for on behalf of my father and me or something like that. One of the heel guys comes out, which is Jacob Ryan, who ended up wrestling, basically jumps my son. Well, my son had been training, but all it was supposed to do was give him a clothesline and a couple boots. Well, when he gave him the clothesline, he broke two of his ribs. And I watched this video over and over thinking, okay, I know my son was green. Did he do something wrong? But I don't know how you can do something wrong taking a clothesline. I looked and the clothesline he caught him so low and was so stiff with it. And then they tried to say, well, it was his fault because he was green. I watched. I was like, no, it wasn't. So they set that up for a match 1 month later with me and this Jacob Ryan kid. And I did the best I held this inside for a month. I'm like, because I'm gonna teach this kid a lesson, just like I was always taught a lesson. It just got so escalated in this match. Because when I wrestled and anybody else who wrestled back in the day, when somebody starts getting stiff on you and you realize, okay, they aren't working anymore, you shoot back. That was why my dad had me go wrestle the Iron Sheik, Don Knuckle, all these shooters back in the day, because you had to be legitimate at amateur wrestling to be in the ring in case shit like this happened. I've had many guys try to take advantage of me, and most of them could have tore me a new asshole, but I fought back enough to where they like, okay, he's a fighter. So that being said, this was set up, and the kids in the back, oh my God, completely different business. He wants all these spots, and I just like, yeah, kid, yeah, whatever, I can't believe the shit he's trying to get me to do, and I didn't even know the moves he was talking about. So I'm like, sure, whatever. Get in the ring. I did an interview. I did a shoot interview. I'm like, okay, this is what a receipt is when you hurt somebody in this business. Dropped the mic, tied up with him. The video is still on YouTube. He just dropped down and started basically crying. And I just was going to get stiff on him a little bit. And the whole thing only lasted 30 seconds. So he hauled up. It was kind of like, and I said this before, it's kind of like you don't run from a bear. Not that I'm a bear, but it did trigger something. I just kept pounding on him. And, took him on the outside of the rope, kind of DDT'd him on the ground. The bell rang because the promoter realized, hey, he's, this kid ain't going to fight back and Brad ain't playing. And I got up and walked away. And next thing I know, I've heard so many that I took advantage of them. And this could have happened a million times in the business if guys never fought back. It just was a sign of the times of how different the business is. You had a guy who barely probably could professionally wrestle as an entertainer and definitely had zero amateur wrestling ability. And everybody was like, I took advantage of him. I told him what I was going to do. And he chose not to fight back. And he probably learned, I better learn how to throw a clothesline next time. But that really, I went into hiding after that, because the only person who took up for me was Jim Cornette on his podcast. Everything else I heard was like, I'm sure they had misinformation, but they tore me apart for doing that. And I probably should have taken the kid in the back in the dressing room and done something, but I never thought it would escalate like that. I thought I would just go out there and I'd get a little stiff on him. We'd have a match. It never worked out like that, because he rolled up into a ball and just started crying basically from the start. And
yep.
I mean, I was raised differently, that part is what I'm leaving out right now. And that's what I always heard. No matter how bad your opponent is, it's your job to look good. If he's the shits, let him be the shits. You make sure you look good. So when I realized he's the shits, I just had to do something to continue to be a respectable wrestler, even though it was a small house. It was, but that's all I had known my whole life of being trained is it's not my job to make him look good. It's his job. If he can't look good, then get stiff on his ass.
Good point. Good point. So before we let you go, tell us again about the Greg Price, the convention, and where everybody can find you if you're on your socials.
Yeah, I'm on Facebook under Bradley Anderson. I had an old Facebook page, Brad Anderson, and I did go through a time where I wouldn't accept friend requests from no, but like since I've kind of gotten back into wrestling again, I look and like, oh, they're mutual friends. They're a wrestling fan. I always accept them. So that would probably be the best way. I don't post much, but people can DM me on there, and I do respond. But that's pretty much my only social media outlet, I guess. But again, yeah, Greg Price, Fan Fest, July 12th. Monroe, North Carolina, the Ag Center. It's on a Saturday. They're going to have, your fan signings, picture signings, photo ops, and all that stuff, door prizes. He's always had a great show. That was the highlight of the year when he used to do that in Charlotte. And again, rock and roll. Tito Santana is going to be there. Curtis Thompson are the names for right now. Rick Link is my brother. Rick Link is going to be there, my wrestling brother. Yeah, that's my plug for that. But I'm looking forward to it. I hadn't seen some of those guys in 10, 15 years.
Love that. Some rare names. You're going to be part of that. Very, very cool. But Brad, thank you so much for all the time today. Really appreciate it. Great stuff.
Thank you very much. It was great talking.